she's going to Australia to see her. Uh-huh.
All right. We have 3 chapters of Ezekiel today to get through. We're not going to look at all 3 chapters, don't worry. Overall, kind of the key thing we're going to look at today is
I won't take it.
The key thing we'll look at today is this vision that Ezekiel has. If we say Ezekiel 1 is the vision of God coming to Ezekiel in Babylon, right? This vision is going to be Ezekiel being taken to Jerusalem to see what's going on in Jerusalem, kind of at the point of the vision, more or less. So let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll be in Ezekiel chapter 8 when we get started here. All right, we'll pray. Almighty and gracious God, we thank and praise you for everything you give to us. God, your word will show us today that sometimes our own sin, our own idolatry can even happen in places that we would never think it would. That we think about even times where we might be in your church, but might be tempted to gossip or to deceive or to lust or anything, God. How grievous when we would do that so close to where you have promised to serve us and give us your grace. God, we pray that you would bless us in our study this day, that we might take these things to heart and live according to them. We ask this in Christ's holy name. Amen. All right, so if someone would read the first 4 verses of Ezekiel 8.
In the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day, while I was sitting in my house, and the elders of Judah were sitting before me, the hand of the sovereign Lord came upon me there. I looked, and I saw a figure like that of a man. From what appeared to be his waist down, he was like fire, and from there up, his appearance was as bright as glowing metal. He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God he took me to Jerusalem, to the entrance to the north gate of the inner court, where the idol that provokes to jealousy stood. And there before me was the glory of the God of Israel, as in the vision I had seen in the plain.
All right. One thing we always get that Ezekiel is very precise about when he receives these oracles. And again, if you were studying Ezekiel even at more length than we are, you could get into kind of when all of these things end up occurring. For this point, I think the only thing we're going to take from the date is just 14 years after that first Ezekiel 1 vision, right? So it's been a little while. And then we might say, well, what's happened, right? If we kind of get the picture that Ezekiel 1 is, he's been dragged off, and then here comes this first vision to kind of bring him into being a prophet. That's kind of in one sense 0, right, on the Ezekiel prophet calendar, right? So now we're at 14, and we say, well, what's changed or what's happened? Well, the little things we can just pick up, right, is he's sitting there with the elders of Judah. And now again, where are they? Are they in Judah? No, they're still in Babylon. They're still, perhaps, I don't think we're told there. Well, yeah, I did say, I forgot that. He's sitting in his house, wherever that is. So he's not right by that canal that he was in the first one. But he's sitting there. And so here's the thing. We're 14 years, right, from that first, at least 14 years from that first deportation into Babylon. And what's happened? Well, obviously the people sort of recognize him now as a prophet, right? That's one thing. It's one thing for God to tell you you're a prophet. It's another thing for the people of God to recognize you as a prophet. Now, we would hope those would be very close together, but you never know, right? There were definitely, of course, prophets that were, called false prophets who were true prophets, things like that. So that's changed. The other thing is that we have elders, right? There's a system of governance among the Jews there in Babylon. So they don't just kind of in the time of Babylon just go, well, no one will get together. We'll have no leaders. We're just, we're scattered, so it doesn't matter. Now, where they were able to, they did have these things. And again, we've talked about this, I think, in other Bible studies. Part of all this is why, we come out of the exile and then, going forward into the time of Christ, and all of a sudden we have these things we never had before, right? Like Pharisees and Sadducees. Well, a lot of that began to arise during this period of exile, where they're trying to figure out, how do we have leaders in our faith with no temple, right? That's kind of a hard deal for the Jewish people to figure out, right? The priest, the high priest, those were, top level leaders. Well, I mean, you could call someone that, but there's nowhere for them to do their work, right? And so during this period, we just want to kind of get this sense that the Jewish people, the faithful Jewish people who care about the faith, are still governing themselves in some way. Okay? I love this picture. God comes, right? The first thing we're told is, right, he looks exactly like he did in Ezekiel 1, right? So the point here is, this is the same God that appeared there coming down, except how does he pick up Ezekiel? His hair, right? Come on, we're going to Jerusalem, Talk about, being dragged somewhere, right? Although, he doesn't, there's no sense in which he says this was painful or something, right? But he's lifted up, and even here, again, we don't want to get, in general, when we're talking about a vision, we have to be careful not to be overly literal. What I mean in this sense is, even the language here, he says, he was taken to Jerusalem in his visions, right? So does that mean, is this a quote unquote like out of body experience that people talk about? Is he literally being kind of picked up and, held over Jerusalem so he can visually see the temple? Or again, what he tells us, and I think is the best way to understand it, is maybe if you asked Ezekiel, I think he'd say, I don't know exactly what happened. All I know is I saw it, right? I saw it in my vision. I was there, right? So we don't, need to get overly concerned with exactly the nature of how God provided this, whether it was just sort of an internal vision or whether, he does talk about being transported, but in his vision. So it's kind of a hard phrase to figure out here. And then at the end, right, verse 4, we got those two things. He sees two things, right? This image of jealousy. We'll come back to that soon. So there's some sort of idol, right? An idol is an image of something, which provokes to jealousy. Provokes who to jealousy? God, right? So there's something there that's going to provoke God to jealousy, but he sees the glory of God there as well. So right from the beginning, we get this idea. There's a big problem, right? In the temple, God is there, and there is this outright idolatry going on in the same temple courts. Right? And we'll get to here in a second to what God says about this, but it's sort of the idea is, you'll get these times where people say that there's not room enough for both of us here in the movies or something like that, right? That's what's going on here. This is the picture being set up, is that this can't be. This can't go on. There can't be idolatry and worship of God in the same temple. So what's going to happen, right? And if we're just reading the Old Testament, quite frankly, what might we think would happen? How would you solve this problem if you're just writing the story? There's an idol, there's God, they're both in the temple. What happens?
Idols destroyed.
Huh?
Idols destroyed.
Yeah, the idol's destroyed, God reigns in his temple. Interestingly, right? That's not what's going to happen here. Okay? Let's read on rather than giving it away too quickly. So what we end up seeing is sort of 4 different abominations, right? Remember, this word abomination in the Bible is it could just be said to be sin, but it's really about the word itself speaks about God's reaction to it, right? That it is something that really fires him up, his wrath, right? It's something, I mean, again, no sin should be taken lightly, but these are sins that are just so sinful, right? So blatant that they particularly kind of stand in God's face. We'll talk. There's imagery of that here too. Last thing before we read verse 5 and 6, then, is like I said, there's 4 of these things he's going to show us, and we'll kind of notice a progression. One is that each one, the only one that might not follow this pattern is the first one. It's a little hard to figure out what's going on, but each one becomes. Hey, John, be quiet.
Say something.
Each one becomes less secret, meaning it's more out in the open. It's more done without any shame, right? And the other one is it gets closer and closer to the Holy of Holies, right? Remember, again, we don't have time to go into this in great detail, but you sort of, you kind of end up with the temple. There's sort of an outer court outside of the walls, and there's an inner court. Then you go inside to kind of the temple proper, and then you go far enough in. Well, you don't want to go far enough in. If you're the high priest, once a year, you go all the way into the Holy of Holies. But there's a progression in the mind of how close to God are you? Okay, even when you're at the temple, there's a real difference between being in the outside courts and being by the altar. Okay? There's a real difference. And again, we would understand that, right? We don't feel quite the same way about being in this room as we do as being in the sanctuary, right? Or again, if we're standing outside in the parking lot, we might feel a little different than we're here studying God's word. So we can kind of understand this, that in sacred spaces, there's kind of a coming closer to God. Right? Okay, any questions before we go into the 4 different things we see? All right, somebody read 5 and 6.
Then he said to me, "Son of man, look toward the north." So I looked, and in the entrance north of the gate of the altar, I saw this idol of jealousy. And he said to me, "Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The utterly detestable things the house of Israel is doing here, things that will drive me far from my sanctuary. But you will see things that are even more detestable."
All right. So we get this word that it's going to get worse. You're going to see worse things. Does that mean that what they're seeing right there is not bad? No, this would be horrific to start with, right? If this was all that was going on, this would be horrific. We're not told here, right, in Ezekiel 8, exactly what this image of jealousy is. But if you go back into the book of Kings, and the references are there, I think for the sake of time, I'll let you look those up later. But we're told, right, that eventually here in the realm of the temple, when Manasseh, remember King Manasseh, he's like the worst, bad king in the world. And then, after him will come Josiah, right, who will try to reform the nation, but those reforms only go so far. Then we kind of go into the exile. So these are the kings right before the exile in the mind of people. There's a really bad king named Manasseh. There's a really good king named Josiah. And unfortunately, Manasseh's idolatries sort of reign, right? Even after Josiah, very quickly, these things come back. But we're told there that he allowed an idol of Asherah. And Asherah is a Canaanite goddess. In fact, kind of the head goddess. You recognize that most pagan religions will end up kind of having their top god be male, right? But almost always there's sort of a queen goddess that accompanies the male god. And so this is the case in the Canaanite religion. She's the wife of the big god, right? She's the woman standing by his side. And, to some extent, when we talk about Canaanite religion, it almost seems like worship of her was at least as prevalent as worship of the top god. Does that make sense? So she's certainly very, very much there. I won't go off on that tangent. All right. I was going to talk about, sometimes in Christianity, I think there is an urge to want a feminine counterpart to God, right? And in certain churches, they've sort of made someone into that. A gal named, really nice gal that God really likes, named Mary, right? But when you hear about how Roman Catholics talk about Mary, I often think, again, we sometimes maybe need to talk more about Mary to put us on the biblical level of talking about Mary. But Roman Catholics tend to they call her the Queen of Heaven, right? That's one of her titles in Roman Catholicism, Queen of Heaven. Anyways, I wasn't going to bring that up. Sometimes I listen to the Roman Catholics as I drive over to Hoxie, so when these things get on my mind. All right. Anyways, so but they have this female goddess, and here's the worst part about this: just big story picture. What was supposed to happen in the conquest of the Promised Land? Get rid of all the Canaanites, especially, right? And why? Because they had these idols. They're godless people who are worshiping false gods. And now, by the end of the time in the Promised Land, not only do they still exist, but now those gods are being worshipped right in the temple complex. Okay, and I didn't write this on the sheet, but here's what we get. What does God say? What's going to happen? Is he going to destroy that idol and say, get out of here, this is my house? What's he going to do? He's going to leave. Right? And this is a big statement, right? And it does stand against what you would think would happen. And what it really does then is it focuses us in on where we are in the story of God's people, right? And we understand that God is taking this rebellion that's been going for generation after generation at this point, and he is going to bring punishment upon it. And there's one thing God can do to punish you that's worse than anything else, and that's to leave you, right? I mean, I think people go overboard with this where they'll almost try to say, hell's not a place or something. That's wrong, okay? The Bible does talk about hell as a located place of torture and torment, but it is true also that probably the greatest pain there is not even the fire, right? But is you're eternally separated from God. If you're separated from God, you're separated from everything good. That's terrible. And that's really what he's promising here. So he said, it's kind of, we can't both dwell here. And usually, right, I'd raise up a prophet or a king. They would knock this idol, like Josiah did this, right, in many ways, knock the idols down and try to reform and purify worship. But at this point, he says, no, this is going, the idol's going to be destroyed because the temple's going to be destroyed, but God is leaving. Other than the flood, right, the exile is probably the greatest judgment in the Bible. Right? How God speaks at this point. And it's in a very similar way, a very similar thought process, right? That essentially, he's looking down and everyone is evil. But just, there might be a few, right? It's like Noah and his age. There's this tiny little remnant. We're going to talk a little bit more about them, right? But in general, the nation of Israel through and through is bad. And now he's going to destroy it. Not by water, because he can't, right? He promised that. But he's going to destroy it. Chiefly here, he'll say by fire and by sword, right? Those are the two ways he's going to destroy it. Famine also, I guess I should throw in there. Okay. So they're worshiping this. This was the one, it's at the north gate. So this is kind of the furthest away probably from the Holy of Holies in their mind. That being that this is right where you come in, right? Again, as far as its openness, it seems that this is pretty evident, right? And you can look through history. Archaeologists, they find these Asherah poles, right? And what they kind of look like is what we might think of as sort of like a totem pole, where it's kind of a stump of wood that then has an image carved into it. That's what these Asherah poles were. We probably also should say that anywhere you have a feminine goddess, generally it's associated with fertility, right? And with that, then worship tends to become sexual in nature, right? And so, this is the other thing that's going on, right? Most shrines that are going to have an Asherah pole are going to have temple prostitutes, right? And again, this is not like, to them, this is not like a side business. This is the worship, right? Okay. So that's the kind of thing. Again, we don't know to what extent this is going on right there, but that's kind of the nature of this kind of worship. All right, let's go on to 7 to 13.
And he brought me to the entrance of the court. I looked, and there was a hole in the wall. Then he said to me, "Mortal, dig through the wall." And when I dug through the wall, there was an entrance. He said to me, "Go in and see the vile abominations that they are committing here." So I went in and looked. There portrayed on the wall all around were all kinds of creeping things and loathsome animals and all the idols of the house of Israel. Before them stood 70 of the elders of the house of Israel, with Jazdaniah, son of Shaphan, standing among them. Each had his censer in his hand, and the fragrant cloud of incense was ascending. Then he said to me, "Mortal, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the dark, each in his room of images? For they say, 'The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land.'" He said also to me, "You will see greater abominations that they are committing."
All right. So, by the way, Mary did very good there. When you see a name you're not sure of, you take a small breath and you say it with confidence.
That's
You
right.
did it very
That's
well.
right.
That's exactly how you do it. But so now we go, right, and we're going closer. Again, the best scholars who understand the temple complex probably better than anybody else, they still argue about exactly what wall are we talking about here and how this is. But more kind of important than that is just get the idea we're moving closer, right? But now we're sort of inside the walls. And we do know that the temple, the Bible tells us, but it doesn't tell us a lot about what went in there, that there are kind of these rooms around the edge of the temple, probably, similar to like our sacristy, right? If you're going to do these things, you got to have a room to store the stuff that you're going to use in worship. Probably that's what they're used for. And some people believe this is kind of probably the kind of picture here is that they're digging in from the outside so they can see in what's going on in one of these little side rooms in the temple. Now, if there's anything good about this, it's that it's kind of in secret, right? This is not as blatant in your face. They're kind of hiding doing this, but that doesn't make it good, right? But this is kind of like I said, what's going to grow. Here, they're in this room, and on the walls, what's on the walls? What's that? Crawling things, creeping things, right? These are the things that, right, were created in the beginning. And the picture you get is that any false god that's ever been worshipped in Israel has his own little place on the wall, right? And there's an image that represents him there. That's kind of the picture. And so all the idols of Israel are in this little room. And we have 70 elders, right? And here, anytime we see 70, 7 times 10, right, is always kind of a reference to the completion of all things. Because they're both kind of complete numbers, right? 7 days of a week, and then 10 just becomes this multiplier of completeness. So probably here, these are the elders, not the priests, right? So the elders are kind of thought of as the head of the people, the lay people. And in that sense, probably this 70 means this is everybody. Right? So this goes back to this idea of how like the flood this is. He's basically saying, go meet any random Israelite, they're worshiping idols. Right? And think about that. I mean, that's not good, right? If you can basically say every Israelite is worshiping some idol. Now we do know, and even some of the stuff we see in the temple, there's some question. They've got, like, when they go to the Asherah pole, are they simply saying we're worshiping a Canaanite god? Or have they somehow convinced themselves, sort of like the golden calf, oh, this is our God who saved us out of Egypt? We don't know that answer for sure. So, but it really doesn't matter in the end, right? Both are idolatrous, because either you're outright worshiping something that is not your God, or you're substituting something for your God. So neither of those is good. And again, some of these Israelites, again, might have been worshiping these other things. Some people go as far as to say, these words of warning that have been coming through the prophets about the destruction of Jerusalem, that may be part of why idolatry grew among the people at the end, was because they actually were sort of afraid of all these words of prophecy. But then what they began to do was sort of hedge their bets, right? We'll worship all gods, right? This is why, and you may have said this, I may have said this sometime in my life, but I hate it when I think about it. When people will tell people, well, I'm gonna believe in God because, that way, if I'm wrong, nothing happens, and if I'm right, I go to heaven. Right? Where it's kind of like just a hedge. I'm gonna, and it's like, first, come on, man. We're talking about, if you're believing in God, it's your whole life that's supposed to be wrapped up in this. So it's not a little hedge bet. You're either all in or all out, right? But I'm just saying, we do hear this kind of stuff every once in a while where people are just sort of like, oh yeah, I'll do this in case, and maybe that's part of what they're doing here. And again, they get these Canaanite ideas that different things are connected to different gods. So if you want your crops to grow, right, you need to pray to this God. And so they say, well, gosh, he's talking about famine. I guess I should pray to that God, right? When you're confused and you start to get into idolatry, all of a sudden, right, it can go anywhere. But this is what we see here. There's all these shrines, all the people. In the middle of them, we get this guy. Now I need Mary back. How did she pronounce it? Jazaniah, something like that. Jaazaniah. We won't go into detail here except to say that his dad is the one when Josiah the king, well, the other guy finds the book of the law. He delivers it to Josiah and says, hey, we found this book, i.e. the Bible, right? That we haven't been doing anything of. Josiah gives it to this guy who's standing in the middle, his dad. And his dad then is in charge of getting this read to all the people. So he's an important figure in a faithful reform led by King Josiah. And this is his son, right? Who's doing the exact opposite. He's leading, in sense, all this idolatrous worship. Make it even worse, we know that this guy had 3 other sons, and each of them in the Bible, I mean, there's just a little phrase about each, but they each played faithful roles, right? Doing this or that for the service of the kingdom of God. So this is kind of the black sheep of the family here, and in the worst way. Right? So he's turned his back. And again, unfortunately, it's not just him. I mean, when you read the story of Josiah in the Bible, you think, yes, things are turning around, right? It looks good. The Passover is being celebrated. The idols are being destroyed. And you kind of get hopeful. And then, like I said, as soon as Josiah's reign comes to an end, it flips like this, right? So we're not surprised that in the same generation, we have someone, or the next generation from his father, that we have somebody that is going with what the rest of the Israelites are doing, which is turning to idols instead of the true and living God. Okay? And certainly, right, we know in our own families and things that we would love to believe always that one generation and the next will be equally devoted to God. But we know not so, right? And it goes both ways. Our hearts are sad because we usually see mostly the ones where we have people that are faithful in one generation and then their children are not so faithful, right? But rejoice, there are also those cases. You hear these people who say, I didn't grow up in the faith. My parents didn't go anywhere, right? Not to pick out my wife, but Jamie's story is kind of like that. She did not grow up in a religious home, right? But now in this generation, right, things have changed for the good. So both ways there, right? We want to be realistic. that unfortunately in humanity, these changes can be rather sudden in time. Like, it doesn't take that long. It's not a slow thing. All right. For 14 and 15.
Then he brought me to the entrance to the north gate of the house of the Lord, and I saw women sitting there, mourning for Tammuz. He said to me, "Do you see this, son of man? You will see things that are even more detestable than this."
All right. So now, right, we're getting still kind of closer. Here we have these particular women, and they're worshiping this Tammuz, which, as I put there, what most people say it was a Sumerian king. Again, in most pagan religions, right, the kings sort of become gods, right, or godlike figures. And so this guy was, a real human, but by this point he's being worshipped. He's become a god in their mind rather than a historical figure. Does that make sense? Not that they wouldn't have recognized that he was in history, but now he's a god to be worshipped. And then this interesting note is the idea, though, is that how this guy died, or was at least went away, was that his own wife banished him to the underworld, right? And so then we get this phrase, because there are some of your translations, at least there, they were mourning? Yeah, okay. So mourning, you might go like, well, why are they mourning by this God? Well, this was sort of how you worship this God, because the thought was he goes into the ground and he dies. And so then the thought was he's kind of the cause of infertility, and particularly infertility of the ground, and particularly as we move from the wet season of spring into the dry season of summer, right? And so you mourn kind of his banishing in order to kind of hope that you aren't going to experience the same thing with your crops, is sort of the idea. And realize so much of this worship is about fertility of one sort or another, right? Whether that be children or crops. This is what people desired, right?
Well, they needed that to survive.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And then it was all about survival.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Certainly. All right. I put a note there, just that they say probably the religion of the worship of Tammuz probably came over from the area of Mesopotamia. If you're interested in such things, you can get out your map and look at that. All right, 16 through 18.
Then he brought me into the inner court of the house of the Lord, and there at the entrance of the temple, between the portico and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and the face towards the east. They were bowing down to the sun in the east. And he said to me, "Have you seen this, son of man? Is it a trivial matter for the house of Judah to do the detestable things that they are doing here? Must they also fill the land with violence and continually provoke me to anger? Look at them putting the branch to their nose. Therefore I will deal with them in anger. I will not look on them with pity or spare them. Although they will shout in my ears, I will not listen to them."
All right, just out of curiosity, on verse 17, they put the branch, I think you had to their nose, essentially. Does anyone have a different phrase? No? They mostly have that? Okay. I guess we're mostly using the same translation here. Some translation will have that different. We'll talk about that at the end here. Notice that most pagan worship ends up worshiping the sun, because it's pretty easy to deduce that the sun's important for life. And so typically pagan worship will sort of end up having some god and the sun related, and you're sort of, that becomes your ultimate idol, is the sun. And I was thinking about that again, like, we say, oh, people don't worship idols anymore, right? Know anybody that goes out and hangs out in the sun a lot, spends a lot of time in the sun? Yeah. Particularly, again, you might say, not that we all don't like the sun, but irreligious people. And if they're going to do worship, right, of some sort, where are they going to go? They're going to go sit on the beach. They're going to cross their legs. They're going to put their hands out. They're going to build maybe a little idol of rocks first. And they're going to face the sun. I was just thinking about this, and I didn't look this up. But my mind strikes me that, like, if you see, and, we talk about this more, I think we've talked about once, but the idea of yoga, right? At the very least, right, yoga is a practice that comes from Eastern religions, right? And I was just thinking, imagine in your mind a poster for yoga. Right? Isn't it almost always going to have the sun in the background? I don't know if that's true, but in my mind it's true that, like, when I imagine those posters, there's always, so I'm going to go Google that after church. Yoga pictures, and I'll let you know. But, so again, it's something that sort of ends up doing this. So what do we find? Well, first, who do we have here? Are these elders now? Actually, these are priests, right? Or does it say elders? I might have written that down wrong. Just 25 men. Okay, right. Yeah, thank you. So 25 men, and the reason most people think they're the priests is because we know that the priests were divided up into 24 divisions, okay? And then there was the high priest that was over them all. So most people think that's the reference to 25 here, is that this is a reference to the priests. And it also makes sense because they are right by the Holy of Holies. And again, only the priests would stand there, period. But how are they standing? Back to the temple. And specifically, we would say here, back to the Holy of Holies in the temple. Right? We talked about this, I think, last week, right? That, like, when we pray, we turn to the altar, right? That we're facing who we're worshiping. And these guys are too. The problem is, what are they worshiping? And the sun is to the east. And interesting, the Holy of Holies is to the west. Okay? So they're standing like this to God. Okay? While they're worshiping. Now it's got really bad, right? It's the priests, it's right there, and they're doing something that just the very nature of it is not only blasphemous, idolatrous, but it's just in your face to God, right? We're going to come into your space and worship the sun, and to do so, we're going to turn our backside towards you. Right? That's how bad it's got. That's why the exile must happen. Some people think, in fact, the main author of the commentary, kind of from our church body on this, kind of speculated maybe this is why God put the Holy of Holies in the west to start. It's because he understood that sun worship was going to be a problem. And so he particularly faced people away from the sun. That's just speculative. But it is interesting to me, if you know this about churches, right, in the Western Christian tradition, if you build a church exactly in the proper way, right, the altar will be to the east. Now, again, ours is to the north, right? I was over at Hoxie. Theirs is to the west, right? The Catholic Church, even here in town, is to the north, if I'm thinking right. Yeah. But again, if you talk to somebody that knows church architecture and you were building a church, they would tell you the altar should face the east.
That's why it was
Was it? It was to the east?
Yeah.
Okay. I wondered about that. And again, somebody did ask me that I was talking to about this, it's kind of like, well, why aren't more churches? And I said, well, I think the real answer is it's practical considerations, right? We want to build Sunday school rooms and we want to do this. And this is how the church would face to make it work on the land we've got or whatever, right? It is probably how a lot of those decisions get made. Obviously, some don't know of these traditions, right? Things like that. That's possible too. It's not, again, a biblical thing. So, but I did find it interesting this week that the temple went to the west. We worship to the east. And why? Why do we worship to the east? Ever been told?
Because Jesus is supposed to come from that.
All right, right. So, and we get that from a couple things, right? Malachi says that he will rise like the Son of Righteousness, S-U-N of righteousness, right? B-S-O-N, but he'll rise like the S-U-N. So again, what position does the sun rise in? What direction? East? What am I trying to say? Direction, I guess. The east, right? Jesus says, when I return, it'll be like a flash of lightning that'll flash from east to west, right? And there's one more. Just the fact that Jesus rises on at dawn, right? At sunrise. So again, we have all these kind of things. Now, again, this isn't in the Bible to tell us to do this. And I did read several people that suggest probably what happened here also. They probably use those reasons also to teach, right? But that the other thing is, you remember the early Christians, most of them are Jews, are still going into the synagogues, right? And probably, again, the synagogues are arranged with kind of the head of their, whatever's there, an altar or whatever, again, is to the west to model the temple, to model the tabernacle, things like that. That's how it was. And when the Christians get kicked out of the synagogues, right, one of the answers when people say, why don't you worship on Saturdays anymore like they did in the Old Testament and you worship on Sundays, is we got kicked out, right? And I mean, historically it's true. The Jews said, if you hold to Christ, you can no longer worship with us, right? I mean, the other thing is, from Easter on, we said, this is the day Jesus rose. This is the most important day. But that perhaps when they got kicked out and finally got to build their own churches, which took a while, right, because of persecution and things, that they purposely did the opposite of the Jews, right? Kind of because they had been kicked out of those spaces. Again, all of this is somewhat speculation. But the idea is, when we're in worship this morning, right, if we were facing the east, so get ready for this. Let's see, if Christ returns, we're all going to have to turn to the right. Okay, so we're facing the east. But the general idea of building a church this way is that if you were in church and Christ returns, you're already looking exactly where he's coming. Same reason we're buried with our feet to the east, right, our heads to the west, so that when Jesus comes back and we're raised from the dead, we sit up and we see him right away. So, yeah, just interesting stuff. And again, all of this, like some of it we have in the Bible that God told the Old Testament people to do. That's a law, right? A lot of it is, let's remember that the people of God have always been good at saying, let's take what we do and teach with it, right? So if we're going to build a church, just don't ask, what are the cheapest materials we can build a church with? Or, what do we think is the prettiest color? We want to ask, how can we use this structure to teach about God? Right? And the coolest places that you'll find to worship in are typically those that spent a lot of time thinking about it. Right? Oh, we're going to put this story here, and this story here, and this story here, so that even if you're not listening to the preacher, you're getting this story as you look off into the windows. Right? All right, that last part where it talks, a stick in their nose or something like that. There were 4 options of what this means. It's very hard to translate from the Hebrew. So one is that they're standing there and they're doing some sort of worship move, right? Putting their hands up, and that's what it's talking about, right? That they're just doing whatever the ritual said to do to the sun. The second is just that it means, that it's sort of an idiom that just means, right? You stick your nose up, right? Look what I'm doing, God. It's a very prideful thing. And again, doing this in the house of the God would have already sufficed to make that point. But that could be the meaning of those words. The third one, right? If you're a man who still thinks like a boy, you'll like this one, right? Could be that the idea here is actually that they're, with their backsides turned, they're passing gas, and what's going into God's nose is gas. Okay. And the last one, and this is where some translations, it will read, they put a stick up my nose, not their own nose, but that, they're basically just, again, putting it up there. I don't know how to say that, right? Regardless, all of these speak of pride, right, before God's people. All right, or I'm in God's people, against God. And again, the whole point is, this is so bad, I'm going to leave. All right, you got something?
I was just thinking today, God's attitude or people's attitude of God is giving him the finger.
Yeah,
Same
right.
thing,
Right. Yeah, that's, I mean, yeah, that's probably the equivalent here. Yeah, exactly. We don't have time to read these verses, but I do want to take you through these last two. There's only 4 verses there, so you can read these later. We jump a little bit here to chapter 9. And what God says, this deals with this remnant. He says there are going to be these people who are faithful, and this man in this white, clean linen robe is to go and he's to mark on people the sign of the Tav, which is a Hebrew letter, which, if you see there how it's written, earlier in time, right? So probably in Ezekiel's day, these are all examples they found in archaeology, by the way, of how they write this. What does it look kind of like? A cross, right? I mean, even in Christian tradition, even the X is just a cross turned a little bit, right? So the modern ones go away from that a little bit. Some people will argue that the Jewish people have changed how they wrote this letter in order to ignore this prophecy that might speak something of Christ. I don't know if that can be proven, right? But we can say it's markedly changed how it's drawn, right? On the left, you see the cross. On the right, you wouldn't initially think that's a cross, right? When we get into Greek, there's also a letter T in Greek. And again, in Greek, it's basically like a capital T, right? And so again, very similar to a cross shape. People will, argue whether this is really the point is that it's in the shape of the cross, but it really is a mark to save them from destruction. And as I put there, we see this Cain, right, receives a mark so that people won't murder him. The Israelites put this mark of the blood's lamb in the Passover. What other one? Oh, Christian baptism, right? It's one of the first things we say. I mark you upon your forehead and your heart to mark you as one redeemed by Christ the crucified. In the book of Revelation, there's also this. You either get the mark of the beast or you get the mark of Christ. So God marks people to save them from the destruction of his wrath. And for us, the baptism one is the one we want to take most to heart, right? We're marked, we're saved from God's own wrath because of Jesus, right? And that gift he gives us through baptism. You know what? We'll read the next one next time. So we'll start with just that because it is important. We're going to get a lot of judgment from here on out. So we'll start next time with this word of hope that's at the kind of near the end of chapter 11 about what God promises after the exile. So we'll start there next time. But let's close with the word of prayer. Dear Lord God, as we go into your house now, may our hearts be pure and may our worship be directed to you alone. For only you are the one who has saved us, has sent your Son to die and to rise for us. In his name we gather now. Amen. Goodbye, crew of Oxy. Everybody's being slow today. Great rainy day.
Yeah.
Early.
Get all my notes.
He didn't eat his cookie.
The biggest concern is all
Right.
Well, what is the right thing to do?
Yeah.